So Carol Delany speaks about Edward Sapir, who is a very famous linguist of the 20th century, together with Woolf. And referring to his work, she says that we actually are what we speak. And she reports a really beautiful quote by Sapir, in which from 1949, in which he says, "No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached." And this is a Sapir in 1949. So I want to start with this question today. What does it mean that through language we live in different worlds? What does it mean that we are what we speak? And how do we understand that language is perhaps more than just labels that we give to a world out there? So more than a transparent expression of social reality. And a very simple answer to this question is that language shapes our culture, and with this it shapes the way we apprehend the world. And in turn, culture and the way we think, we live, we relate to the world shapes our language. And a really good example comes from Julie Cruikshank, who did research with Atapascan and Tlingit elders in the corner between Yukon, Northern BC, and Alaska. Cruikshank writes that for Atapascan and Tlingit elders, glaciers are animate. They can move, they respond to human actions, they even get offended, and they also have senses like humans. For example, she says that glaciers can react if someone in their vicinity is cooking with grease. And to help the reader explain this notion and explain what she means, she tells some of the stories that the people have told her about glaciers during her work. In her book, Do Glaciers Listen, for example, she recounts a story told to her by Annie Ned. This story takes place close to the St. Elias mountain range, again, in the corner between Yukon, British Columbia, and Alaska, and talks about one man called Frank Stick. So Frank Stick, one morning, put a thick piece of goat grease in a pot and started cooking with it. But as soon as he did that, the Lake Arkell Glacier that he was close to started moving. John Stick got very alarmed. According to Annie Ned, who is telling the story, Frank Stick could smell that there was something inside that glacier. And Frank Stick should have known better. He knew that cooking with grease, like frying bacon for breakfast over a campfire, can make a glacier crack, can make it surge and advance, and can bring disaster for people who live or travel nearby. Fortunately, John Stick was very quick. He realized that what he was doing was really dangerous. He took a blanket, threw it over the fire, and so the glacier quieted down. Disaster, however, could not be averted in another story, this time told by Tlingit elder Susie James in 1972 and by Amy Marvin in 1984. And these are also stories that Julie Cruikshank refers to in her book, Do Glaciers Listen. These two elders tell about a woman called Castine, who was at the time on her puberty seclusion. And what a puberty seclusion means is that when girls become women and have their first periods, then they spend a period of time in partial isolation. And during this isolation, they are instructed by their relatives, and they have also a series of restrictions. Castine, in particular, in this story, was staying in an extension of her main house that was walled off with a cedar bark curtain. And one evening, her mother brought her dried salmon strips to eat. After eating, perhaps because she was bored, we don't know, Castine pulled up the curtain and waved the remaining bones of the salmon, joking to the glacier. She called the glacier as if it were a dog, waving the bones of the salmon like this, and she went, "Here, glacier, here, here." Her youngest sister, who was only 8 years old, got very alarmed because she saw this, and she knew that this was a problem. So she ran off to tell her mother, but it was already too late. The ice began to advance. It was churning and moving underground, perhaps a bit similarly to an earthquake, and soon enough, it was dragging the whole village with the glacier. People had to flee immediately. Meanwhile, Castine and her family faced a very difficult decision because they felt that someone had to stay behind to pay for this infraction. In one version of the story, tells Cruikshank, Castine's maternal grandmother offered to stay behind so that Castine could flee with the others and be safe. But in another version, Castine itself decided to stay behind to take responsibility for her action. So according to these two stories, glaciers are sensitive. They get offended by rude behavior, for example, by things that humans do, and by insolence, and they are very quick to respond. In the story, they had only a few moments to escape because the glacier was surging and moving forward. Glaciers, interestingly, also have senses. They can hear, for example, they can hear Castine calling, they can smell, for example, can smell the bacon. In other stories, they can also see. In turn, glaciers engage people's senses. They are noisy, they can emit light, they can even give out heat in some situations. So glaciers here are understood as sentient beings. These, for example, are some of the quotes that Cruikshank has in her book explaining the ideas of her interlocutor. She says that glaciers take action, respond to their surroundings, they listen, this is even the title of her book, and Glaciers Listen, they make moral judgments and they punish infractions, and they are conscious, willful, sometimes capricious, easily excited by human interference. So very much sentient beings. And so we can say that for Atapascan and Tlingit elders, glaciers are animate. So they can move, they can listen, they respond to human actions, but at the same time, they're also animating. What this means is that they can change their surroundings, sometimes very dramatically. They can, for example, facilitate travel and trade in that region. They also can bring major consequences on the lives of the people who are living or traveling nearby. Glaciers can also become important characters of stories, songs, and recollection. And these two stories that I have recounted from Cruikshank, who recounted them from the elders, show that glaciers are very much central characters of stories that are told sometimes from generation to generation. Now, we're talking about language. So what is important for us in all this regarding language? Well, Cruikshank says that these qualities of glaciers, with being animate and as well animating, are very nicely encapsulated in Tlingit and Atapascan languages. Cruikshank explains that these two language families are very rich in verbs rather than nouns. What this means is that Tlingit and Atapascan languages give a particular weight to action and to movement. Moreover, in Atapascan languages, like Cruikshank's, you know if something is animate if the verb signals or if the verb tells you that it has the power to act on other things or to move. And actions are often attributed to entities, such as glaciers, that English speakers would define as inanimate or not alive. So basically, while in English we know that something is alive or an object by its very name, by the definition that is attached to its name, for example, cup or pencil or ball, in Tlingit and Atapascan, it is actually the verb that tells you if something is animate or not. This, very interestingly, changes the very definition or the very distinction between animate and inanimate. It seems that animate-inanimate distinction is not so much an attribute that is intrinsic to things and people, but is more a result of what they do, of their relations with the world. And this, of course, is my understanding based on Cruikshank research, because I myself do not know Atapascan or Tlingit, so I can only understand this through what Cruikshank describes. And in fact, Julie Cruikshank explains that due to this, it was very difficult for her to write about glaciers in English and to translate Atapascan and Tlingit ideas of glacier and glacial landscapes, because the very structure of English, so to speak, could not really express these meanings that it had for the people she talked to. And if some of you know more than one language, know more than English, then this might be something very familiar. You might have been in a position where you have to translate an idea, a concept, or a story in another language, and you had difficulties. So my question for you right now is, have you ever experienced a difficulty translating a word or a concept from one language to another? Which concept was it? Why did you have a difficulty with it? And you can even think of emotions. It is sometimes interesting how describing emotions from one language to another, you have some ideas, some names of emotions that are intranslatable. So in Italian, you can say I love you in two different ways, and they have two different meanings. And that is, for me at least, is always a problem of translation, because when I translate ti amo and ti voglio bene into English, there is only one I love you, but I can translate it to. So ti amo in Italian is I love you sorry, as referred to a partner. That's how you would use that formulations. But if you want to say I love you to your mother, or I love you to your friend, or you know, to your grandparents or to a daughter, then you cannot say ti amo, but you would say ti voglio bene. Now, there is no difference in terms of the strength of emotion. You love very much in both of these formulations, but it's a different kind of love. That's what these different expressions tell you. But when we try to translate it into English, you know, we cannot. It's just I love you. It's a more generic kind of love. Another thing that doesn't translate very well is envy and jealousy. So in Italian, you have invidia and gelosia, but they do not really translate into envy and jealousy, although those are translation for it, because invidia means both envy and jealousy, and it ranges from even a compliment and a good thing to a very dangerous feeling. And gelosia always entails the fear of losing somebody, and it is always negative, ranging from just a little bit negative to very dangerous and perhaps very passionate. There are these translations that they really do not catch what Italians understand with invidia and gelosia, envy and jealousy. And another example is this one. Look at these cows and tell me, what colors are these cows? If you look at them like me, you would probably say, well, these cows are black and white. However, for newer speakers, these cows are jock and quay and cool and bill and roll and par and quack and wea and cool, rang, car and qual. And, you know, I'm sorry for the pronunciation. I don't know how to pronounce this. But what is interesting here is that newer vocabulary for cows, it has all of these different words depending on how the color is distributed on the body of the cow. Of course, we can also say, oh, that is a cow that is almost all black, but its head is white. But that is a much longer way of describing the cow than simply saying quay, right? Or look at rang and car. One has a white part on top of the cow in a line, and one has a white part in the bottom half of the cow. Again, we don't have these very specific words, right? And this is from the book Manure by Evans Pritchard, who has this example in his book about manures. And when we think of all of these examples, the interesting questions here is, how does the language that is available to us shape the way that we understand the world? If we think back of emotions like love or envy and jealousy, how does it shape the way we define and characterize emotions? So does everyone have the same emotions, the same experiences of the world, but they are simply called differently? Or do the very terms and definitions in one language versus another actually shape how we feel, what we experience? This is a very complicated question of does the language actually shape the way we feel about the world, or do we just perceive the world and then we put different labels on it? And this is really the same question we had when we talked about time, right? And there are many very interesting examples in how some languages quantify time, like we can say 10 days, like we can say 10 pencils, but some other languages, for example, Hopi, do not do that and cannot talk about time in quantifiable chunks. There again is that questions, well, do we just all go through time in the same way, but then call certain things differently, or does the very language available to us, so language as a resource, shape the way we perceive time, the way we know time, right? And of course, this is a question that we cannot really answer. It has to stay a question. But here, what I want you to think about, what I want you to pay attention to, is a complex relationship between language, culture, and our experience of the world. One important thing that anthropologists have pointed out is that often words and languages relate to a whole perspective, a whole cultural outlook. And here we still have the cows on our screen. So the reason, or perhaps we can postulate that one of the reasons why Nuer have so many words for colors of cows is because cattle are so important in the society. They are the center of a kinship system. They are the center of a ceremonial and religious system. And they're really prized and loved possessions. They also are the basis of their economy as well.